On the last episode, we finished our teardown of the car and cleaned up the internal airbox. With all of that taken care of, it's finally time to start installing AC components and check that our wiring harness is going to make all of its necessary connections. After our extended cleanup in the previous episode, the internal airbox was ready to be reinstalled. Before we do that, however, now would be the time to remove the factory heater wiring harness and swap it for the air conditioning one. Unfortunately, I have very limited footage of the process. However, with everything removed, it is as simple as popping out the grommet, pulling the old wiring out, and doing the inverse with the new harness. Installing the airbox can be a little cumbersome to do alone. I was lucky enough to have a buddy hold the airbox in from the inside, while I secured the fasteners from the engine bay.
Well, that's looking pretty good. Let me try and get a nut in. That's fine.
For right now, only one fastener is required to hold the airbox in, as the others will pass through the engine bay airbox as well, so they'll be installed later. As noted previously, there is a missing hole for one of these fasteners along the bottom edge, and we'll be taking the easy way out by simply ignoring it. Now that we have the internal airbox installed, we need to connect the heater hoses back to the heater core before we can install the engine bay airbox. Although installation is just the opposite of removal, these hoses are a pain to reach and just generally a chore to deal with. Once they've been slipped over the barbs, however, it is as simple as tightening down the hose clamps. It should be noted that I did not opt to install a heater valve that would block the flow of coolant to the heater core when the air conditioning is turned on, as it is both not necessary and adds substantial engine bay clutter. With the heater hoses attached, we can now attempt to fit the lower part of the engine bay airbox. This required more than a little bit of creativity, as the large wiring harness traveling across the top of the firewall is directly in the way of installation. After more than a little trial and error, and finding which combination of stretching the wiring and squeezing the airbox past would work, I eventually got the airbox into place and was able to secure the remaining fasteners. There are fasteners traveling along the top edge of the airbox that are accessible from the engine bay, and there are fasteners along the bottom which are accessible from the interior. I made the mistake of installing every fastener I could see, which resulted in me needing to remove some in order to install the top half of the airbox later on. So I would advise mocking up the top half of the airbox to note which fasteners need to be installed in which order. Before installing the top half of the airbox, the evaporator needs to be slid into the casing. This is very simple to do as there are no fasteners holding it in place. It is simply squeezed into position by the casing and its foam insulation.
This isn't backwards, isn't it? Oh boy.
Well, the wiring harness struck again. We had to stretch it over the evaporator, but after doing so, it simply slid right into the casing.
Aha. There we go. Good. Nice. A little premature bolt action.
As my friend so kindly pointed out, we had to remove some of the bolts in order to install the top of the airbox. This is because these bolts pass through the upper and lower airboxes before mounting to the firewall. With these out of the way, the upper airbox can be installed.
Now's the fun part. Yeah, get to go under this wiring harness even more. Just get on the other side of it. Okay. We're in. Oh yeah?
Now that it's in place, we can install the 2 bolts securing the top half of the airbox to the firewall. One of these we had to remove earlier as we had installed it too soon. Finally, the screws which secure the 2 halves of the airbox together can now be installed. We're next going to be covering the probing I performed to ensure that all the necessary electrical connections were being made. I had already noticed that the main engine bay wiring harness appeared to have the necessary connections for the AC compressor, as well as a hookup to connect to the AC wiring harness. However, I wanted to make sure that no connections were missing, as well as ensure that a signal is being sent to the ECU to account for the additional load on the engine. So we're just trying to do some electrical analysis here to figure out where all these plugs go. I see there's this big plug up here with 3 pins in it that was previously unused, as well as a matching connector on the air conditioning wire harness. So it doesn't take much guessing to know that those two probably need to go together, but what I'd like to know is where these wires go. So what I'm going to do is, there's a lot of what looks like grease or some sort of goo in there, so I'm going to try scraping it out with the probe, here. And then I've just got some simple alligator clips that I'm going to be using just because I only have 2 hands here and it's hard to hold on. Ideally, you could just get probes that have a clip connection on the other end, but in a pinch, this'll work, especially if I'm just using the polarity detection here, the one that beeps. I forget the term. You'll have to excuse me. But either way, there's 2 connectors for the compressor here. One of them is not in very good shape. You can see all this dust on the valve cover came off from taking off the tape that was covering up this. So I have received a replacement connector. It was only $7 or so, and we'll be replacing it, but luckily this diode has exposed terminals, which will give us a really easy point to clip our alligator clips onto so that we can determine where the other end of this goes. So I'm seeing a black wire here, so the first thing I'm going to do is see if that goes to ground. So with our red probe attached to the black wire's connection here, I'm just going to tap on. There's an exposed bolt on the firewall here. Nope, not getting anything. Maybe that's too far away. We're just going to try. Not sure if you can see, but I'm just going to tap on the the serpentine bracket here. And we are getting a ground connection there. So let me try a different screw on the firewall just to ensure that one's not screwed in all the way. And sure enough, we are getting a connection. So what that tells us is that the black wire on this connection goes to ground. Next off, we're going to try finding the other connector, so we're simply just going to attach it to the other lead coming off the diode here, and we're going to try and figure out what color this is. Now it looks like it's a dark green. Now there's one other place where I've seen a dark green, and it's not in this large connector. This large connector has 2 blacks, a black with stripe, and what looks like a dark blue. But the other place I've seen a dark green is actually just on this other connector here, the smaller connector, which I believe is for, it's the high pressure switch, could be the low pressure switch. It's one of the pressure switches. So here, I'm just going to probe the green terminal, and we can see that that is indeed the location. So what I'm just going to assume based on guessing, and I'm sure there's documentation out there that would give us a better explanation, but it would assume that this pressure switch controls the clutch of the compressor to turn it on or off dependent on the pressure in the system. Now somehow, and I think it's this blue wire here, this also must feed into the pressure switch that goes on the over here near the airbox onto the dryer unit that sits right here. And I bet you that this blue wire here, oh, yes, sorry. There was a blue connection on this big plug that sits by the firewall. So with our alligator clips on that, I'm going to try probing this blue connection, and sure enough we do see a connection, but I believe that the wire is going to travel through this cable here, which is the air conditioning harness, and travel all the way to the other pressure switch. So looking at this connector, the associated wire is indeed still the same color of kind of a dark blue. So unfortunately it's not as easy to get attached to this connector. In fact, no, I think that this connection needs to be cleaned up before they can be connected. So what I'm going to do is probably ill-advised, but I'm just going to jam my probe in there like that. And we're going to take the other lead here, and we are going to find our other pressure switch. Now in this case, where we have female connectors, sometimes you can get away with just stabbing the probe into it. It's generally not a great idea, but for short-term use, it tends to do the trick. And sure enough, we are getting a connection. So that means that once these two harnesses are hooked together, there will be a direct connection between the high pressure switch and the low pressure switch, which makes sense. Now the other things I want to do is I want to figure out where the other two connections here go. Now they're both black connections, so what I would assume is that one of them goes to ground, and I'm guessing here, but I think the other one must go to the ECU, because I know there must be some sort of connection to the ECU, as it tells the computer to adjust for the increased load on the engine when the air conditioning is turned on. However, this is the only place where we connect to the main harness, so it would only make sense that the air conditioning controls talk to the ECU through this connector. So what we'll be doing first is we'll be testing that ground. So I'm going to grab another one of my alligator clips. I like using the red probe. There's no real reason there. So this wire on the outside is completely black. So I'm going to attach this alligator clip to that pin. And we're going to once again tap ground. And we can see that there's a connection. Just to be sure, we're going to tap another place. And we see that there's a connection. So we know that that is ground. As for this connector, I do not know of an easy way of testing it without checking the ECU connector on the inside, which, as a matter of fact, that might just be what I do. Just to give you a better idea of the connector I'm looking at, as I realized the footage before was rather far away, this is the connector I'm talking about. It connects to the firewall using this bolt hole and this bracket. It's loose right now, so I can get the AC box in. I'm still not entirely sure how I'm going to route the harness. It doesn't seem like there's enough room over top, so we'll have to cross that bridge when we get there. But as you can see, there's room for 4 pins, but there's only 3 installed. 1, 2, 3. And that does match up with the other connector down here, which, sorry, I believe this is moving the camera slightly, and I apologize for that. But if this guy has 4 connections, but if you look at the wires, there's only 3 wires coming out of it. So I believe that this is the appropriate connection. And as for the colors, it's a little dirty, so it's hard to tell because they all look black. But this one, if you look further down, is actually a bluish color. This one kind of in the center is black with a white stripe down the side, and the one on the far side here is completely black, and that is the one that we determined to be our ground. So we know this blue wire connects the high pressure switch to the low pressure switch, and we know the black wire is ground. Next, what we're going to check is that this wire with a stripe goes to the ECU. As it turns out, the mystery wire back here with the stripe, if you look closely, it is not black, it is dark green. And after referencing some wiring diagrams in the Haynes manual, it appears as if this wire goes to the electric fan control switch. So this would be the signal that tells the cooling fan to turn on when you have the air conditioning turned on. This blue connector, which connected the high pressure and low pressure switches, is actually the connector that goes to the ECM. So, after discovering that I was looking for the wrong connector, or the wrong color, it became much easier to solve and much easier to find, and I'll show you in the cabin. So I still have the alligator clip of my voltmeter hooked up to the blue connection on the 3-pin connector in the engine bay. And I went about, luckily I have my dashboard out because I had to install the air conditioning airbox as well as get the new wiring harness through the firewall, so I decided to bite the bullet and take the whole thing apart. So I have the ECM cable connectors here dangling. And what you'll note is that there are several blue connectors. There are two, pardon me, I'm slipping. There are two here. I'll get my hand out of the way. There are two here on the larger connector, and then there is one here on the smaller connector. And it turns out to be this smaller one over here. Now, I still have my voltmeter on the polarity mode, and looking on this connector, I saw that it is the 5th pin from the left here on this connector, and the probe is too large to get in there. And you don't want to force something like this in. So what you can do is you can grab a paper clip would work, any small piece of wire really. I have a very small cotter pin here, and we're just going to put that in the hole as to not damage anything, so it won't be bending anything, it just fits right in. And then we can tap our voltmeter to that. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's currently beeping. So that's good news. That means that without rewiring anything, the car already has wiring equipped to tell the ECM that the air conditioning has been turned on, as well as to the electric fan, which I haven't tested that circuit yet, although it is very difficult to reach. So what we'll do is we will connect everything, and if it does not work, we know where to start in terms of troubleshooting. So now that I've got all of the wiring figured out, I'm going to go ahead and replace connectors if needed, and see if I can get everything connected. Alrighty, so we have the new connector installed now. Looking a lot better. You can even see metal, which is definitely an improvement. So with that, the only other connector gremlin I'm having is I purchased the air conditioning wiring harness used, and there's some sort of connector that looks like this. This is the other end of it that I'd like to plug it into. Now, you'll note that this connector here from the previous owner's car, in terms of the previous owner of this wiring harness, the cable ripped right out of the connector and the connector stayed fused to it. Now, as you can see, I have tried many methods to rip this connector apart, still yet with no luck, although I am very close. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue trying to just break this apart, as I'm having trouble finding a replacement connector for this. If that doesn't work out, I will cut off both ends and find a replacement connector to use to connect them that will have non-factory connectors, which is fine by me. So yeah, that is the plan of attack. I will get back to you if this ends up working out. Just a quick status update. We did get the connector removed. However, as you can see, the actual internals of the connector, try not to rock the camera for you, did not survive the operation. This here is what it should look like, and it does not. So this other end of the connection, what I did notice is that, so it's got a male end connector, and what it looks like is we're going to be able to just use one of these quick connectors, and it will connect right on to the existing, this is the main wiring harness of the vehicle this is attached to, and then this is from the air conditioning wiring harness. So with no modification to the car's wiring harness, we can hook it right in as long as we connect this up. That's awesome. That's why they come in a multi-pack, I suppose. But as long as we make a connection like that, we should be okay. We'll see. With the connectors repaired, we reinstalled the blower motor and connected as many loose plugs as we could. At the end, we were left with two, one of which was for the low pressure switch on the dryer receiver, and the other was unknown. After doing some research, the final connector was determined to be used for a relay that powers the blower motor. The blower motor relies on the resistors mounted in the airbox for the lower 3 speeds, but the 4th speed, or full speed, whichever you want to call it, is controlled with a relay. There are no listings online that I could find for replacements for this relay. However, looking at other relays in the car, I found that it appeared identical to a radiator fan relay found on RockAuto. The relay came with a pre-installed metal bracket that is required to mount it in the radiator fan relay location. The air conditioning airbox has its own metal bracket that we will be using, so installation is as simple as removing the original bracket and installing it onto the air conditioning bracket, which mounts to the airbox with just 2 screws. Unfortunately, we didn't get to the vacuum system in this episode like I'd hoped, but you can expect that, along with condenser mounting, in the next episode. Stay tuned.